Hi, my name is Bill Geissele. I'm the owner of Geissele Automatics. We're based out here in Norristown, Pennsylvania. Today we're going to discuss the installation of our high-speed DMR trigger. This was our first trigger that we developed back in 2003 and 2004. We called it a national match trigger because it was designed for national match shooting, high-power shooting at Camp Perry. There's three versions of this: match rifle, DMR, or designated marksman, and service rifle. I'm a service rifle shooter. Some of my friends in New Jersey, where I lived when I designed this trigger, were match rifle shooters. And it had to do both match rifle and service rifle. There's actually three versions of this trigger. There's the lightest one is the match rifle. Out of the bag, it's about 2.5 pounds total weight. There's the DMR, designated marksman. It's approximately 4 pounds, slightly under 4 pounds total weight. And then there's the service rifle trigger. And this trigger is designed to have a weight that's always above 4.5 pounds for NRA and CMP service rifle shooting where there's a weight limit involved. Today the rifle we're going to use, this is an SPR pattern rifle. It's got an 18-inch barrel, an OpSync flash hider, and attachment for a suppressor. It has a stock trigger in it right now, so we're going to go through the removal of the stock trigger pretty quickly. Not going to dwell on it too much. I'm going to assume that there's a video already online that shows the removal of a stock trigger for the SSA trigger. That's our semi-automatic combat trigger. First thing you do is remove the upper, and you have your lower in place here. A lot of people like to work with a bench block and a vise that will fit into the magazine well, and it'll be on a bench and held rigidly. We don't do that here in the shop. You just got to recognize that you got to hold this somehow. You have two hands to work on it, and you need another one in order to hold it. So you don't have three hands. God didn't give you three hands, so you need something. And what we do is we work in our labs, and we use this apron right here. We call it the Geissele third hand, and this catches all the parts and helps us to work like this. I'm going to do my best to show you all the different parts and how everything fits in and out here. Open up your bag, and you have your trigger, hammer assembly, you have instructions, 11 by 17 sheet, both sides printed, pretty detailed. We tried to go over everything that you need, including specific adjustments for the match rifle or service rifle. Comes with tools. It comes with something like this. It's a long pin, hardened pin, a little knob on it. We call it the fitting pin. You also get a set of 3 Allen wrenches for the various adjustment screws. You get a little vial of grease, special grease that we have that helps with the SEAR lubrication. And you get something called a slave pin, which is a small silver pin here, and I'll show you the use of that in a second. You also get a little bottle of oil, just handy to have. We really like this right here. It's got a -60 pour point to it, so it won't solidify up even in Arctic conditions. Stays around on the gun, even when the gun gets very hot. It doesn't really evaporate too fast, and it doesn't smell. So if you're using this for a hunting gun, you're not going to have this reeking oil in your weapon. Take the stock trigger out of the weapon, decock it, and usually to work on an AR you need a set of pin punches right here. It's very handy to have. In this case, we can use the fitting pin for this. It comes with it. Take a small hammer, and tap your stock pin out. Take your stock hammer out. And now you're going to take your trigger out. You notice this apron catches everything. Extremely handy to have. Now, some triggers are a little bit easier to get out than others. This one evidently doesn't want to come past the safety, which is good anyways because we have to remove the safety in order to install the high-speed trigger. So 3/16, I just grabbed the wrong one. 3/16 Allen. Some AR-15s come with a flathead screw in there. I believe that's mil spec. A lot of aftermarket AR-15s come with an Allen head screw in here. I like to leave the pistol grip semi-installed. You notice your spring coming out here. That's your D10 spring for your safety. And what you can do is you just got to lower it enough and lower your D10 enough in order to pull your safety out. In this case, she doesn't want to come out. So let's pull this guy all the way off. And what I'm doing here is I'm dropping the D10. Notice this little guy that came out. Sometimes they stick in there in the receiver. You don't want to lose it. Make sure when you pull that pistol grip off that it doesn't take off on the floor. Here's your safety. Now you can get your stock trigger out of there. Now we're going to install the Geissele trigger. First thing we do is we install the slave pin. And you'll notice this comes completed as a unit. It has a spring on it, all the screws, everything together, including a disconnector. We do not throw parts in the bag and expect you to assemble it. This has all been pre-adjusted at the factory for a nominal mil-spec receiver. You pull your pin out. You take your small slave pin and you push it in. All right, and what you see is the slave pin is slightly below flush on the trunnions, or the bosses here that come out of the trigger. And what this does is it helps your disconnector to remain in place when you're putting this in. We don't use the slave pin here in the shop. We've done so many of these that when we go to push the pins in, we just push the disconnector down with our hands, line the hole up, and push the pin through it. But when you don't do these all the time, it's just a very handy tool. Place your trigger down in the receiver. Make sure the springs of the trigger, the legs that face forward, don't get caught underneath the trigger and get pushed to the back. Now you take your fitting pin. And this is just something very handy to have. You push your trigger down until you see that silver slave pin aligned with the hole. You take your fitting pin and you push it through. Everything just went through, slave pin popped out in my hand. Everything's aligned and in place right here. Now you take your Geissele pin. All right, this is a special pin, special for the high speed. It's made out of 8620. It's case hardened, centerless ground at plus or minus a tenth on the diameter. It has two grooves on one side. On the trigger, the position of the grooves, whether it's on the right or left-hand side of the weapon, doesn't matter. For the hammer, it does. On the hammer, the grooves have to be on the left-hand side of the weapon. That's the side with the bolt catch. These pins are 0.156 diameter, which is the nominal pin size for an AR-15. Tolerances on an AR-15 hole can be plus or minus about 1/1000th of a half. So this pin may either slide in and be fairly loose fit, or it could be an interference fit, and you may have to tap it in with a hammer. It all depends. You can try it yourself when the hammer's out. On this receiver right here, you can see that it slides, but it's very tight. These holes are just about right on. So it all depends. So what you do is you just tap your fitting pin in here, take your pin, and you notice how everything's going right in, nice and easy. I'm going to try to hold it up here. By tapping this pin in, you're going to slide the fitting pin right out. You do not pound. You do not, if something's misaligned, you do not force it. This pin will go right through everything nice and smooth. Fitting pin came out. Now your Geissele pin is properly installed. Now we go to the hammer. The hammer has the pin in it already. You'll notice it's very tight. You really can't push it out with your fingers. In order to get this out, you're going to have to push it out by pushing it against the bench, which even in this case you can't. So what you do is you got to pop it out with a hammer. Just hold the hammer in your hand right here and just give it a quick smack. It'll pop past the circlip that's in there. You can pull it out in your hand. You'll notice the hammer spring legs, how they face down like that. They want to go on top of the trigger pin. They do not go below the pin. They fit on top of the pin. And all you got to do is just lay the two legs on top of the spring. You're going to notice how I'm holding the hammer. One finger here, one finger here. You push it in, and you align your hole up by eye. You can practice this. You don't want to rush. A lot of times, if you're not used to working with things under spring tension, it might be a little bit difficult, and you'll get a line and then try to rush to put the pin in. Don't do that. Take some time in order to figure out your motions. In order to get this aligned, you have to push the trigger down a little bit. You'll see the trigger bow moving in order to get that aligned there. You'll notice I'm wearing prescription glasses. If you don't wear prescription glasses, just please take a moment and put on a pair of safety glasses. We're working with things here under spring tension, and sometimes they can pop out of your fingers and fly across the room, and you don't want it to crack any eye here. Fitting pin in this hand, lower receiver in our Geissele's third hand. We align the holes, push our fitting pin through, and it went right through it. Very handy, very easy to do. Now we take our Geissele pin right here, and we're going to install this. Grooves to the left side of the weapon. Again, very similar to the trigger. A small 4-ounce hammer. Pin has started. The fitting pin is coming out. Everything's installed. You'll notice that the instructions probably tell you here to leave the fitting pin installed in the hammer at this time. You can start your adjustments with that, so you don't have to install the Geissele pin. You can also use the stock pins if the Geissele pins are tight in your receiver, so you're not tapping it in and out. Whatever you'd like to do. In this case, the pins are installed, and now we're ready for the adjustment procedure. The trigger is pre-adjusted from the factory, and what that means is you'll have a second stage, and it'll be very, very close to where you need to be. You cock your hammer, and you pull your trigger. You'll notice on this one we do have a second stage. Here's the first stage. The trigger moves, has slack, and it returns. You come up against your second stage, a little bit more pressure, and the hammer falls. All right. In order to adjust this, the first thing you do is you adjust your SEAR engagement. And you take your largest Allen key right here, and what you're going to do is you're going to put this through what we call the SEAR tower. And I'll have a little exploded view here to show you this a little bit better. It's going to be very difficult to see here. But take your largest Allen key, you fit it in your SEAR adjustment screw. Now you're going to have to press down and press the disconnector down. You'll notice the head of the SEAR adjustment screw is not aligned to the hole in the tower. It's not supposed to be. We designed it that way. Watch your little leg of your Allen key right here. You just note the position of it. You're going to turn it counterclockwise, a little less than half a turn. You're going to pull it out, and you're going to try and see if you have a second stage. And in this case, we still do. So we're going to give it a little more counterclockwise. I did it a third time. And what I was doing there is I was removing the second stage. I'm pushing the disconnector down by turning that screw counterclockwise, and I'm moving it away from the tail of the hammer. And I just removed the second stage. Now we're going to go clockwise, and we're going to find the point where the hammer just touches the disconnector. You can only go in one direction here. You only lose the second stage, and then you regain it. All right, so now just note your position here of your Allen key. We put maybe a quarter turn on it. Still no second stage. Another little turn clockwise. Boom, I have it. As you can see, first stage, trigger stops, a little bit more pressure. Now it goes. We need to add some SEAR engagement at this point. Very simple how you do it. Put your Allen key in. Note where the short leg is, and you're going to give it a quarter turn clockwise plus a little bit. So a little bit over a quarter turn clockwise. You just look right down on it, estimate it, give a little scooch more, and your SEAR is adjusted. You'll notice that your first stage is very smooth, very linear. As you come up to the second stage, you feel a sharp wall and just a little bit more pressure, and this trigger will let that hammer go forward very, very, very crisply. We make a line of non-adjustable combat triggers. The reason we have an adjustable trigger is that the adjustment will compensate for any tolerances that are not perfect in your lower receiver. In our trigger, you can work them all out and get the type of break on the second stage that you as a shooter want. If you want it to break like a small icicle, you adjust it that way. You want it to break like a carrot, you adjust it that way. It's whatever you want. You can make this trigger break exactly like you feel like it should. Right now, with this adjusted this way, the second stage overlap of the SEARs is probably 3 to 5 thousandths of an inch. A human hair is about 2.5 to 3 thousandths of an inch in diameter. So this is hanging on just a little bit less than the diameter of a human hair. It's very small. That's why we have to cut our SEARs with a wire EDM, cut some razor sharp, puts a beautiful fine finish on it, and allows us to have a trigger that can be adjusted to these types of very small clearances. Next step is to adjust your second stage weight. You take your smallest Allen key and you look at the screw that's in front of your SEAR screw, and from the factory this is slightly below flush with top of the disconnector. If you turn it in clockwise, you get a little bit more on the second stage. If you turn it counterclockwise, it lessens it. Now you can move it, and you can just try this and get the second stage weight to your liking. Right here, I'd say this is about a pound, which is pretty much appropriate for a tactical rifle, sniper rifle. We'll take a little bit more out of that. I just gave it about a quarter turn, counterclockwise. I'd say this here is about 0.8 of a pound. That's the beauty of a second stage. You have safety, reliability, forgiveness, and performance all in one package. You cannot design a trigger to have a 0.8 or about a 14-ounce break on the second stage with a single stage trigger. It's impossible to do. The trigger would be unsafe, it would be unreliable. With a two-stage, you have a very generous overlap of the SEAR surfaces. As you pull through the first stage, that overlap decreases. That overlap right there is what controls how sharp your trigger is. On the high-speed trigger, that's adjusted with that SEAR. Come all the way out here for your icicle type brake, move it in a little bit if you like it like a carrot. The weight differential to pull that off is what we call the second stage. That's what we just adjusted. If you have a very linear first stage, which is a hallmark of our triggers, the difference between the first and second stage is very noticeable. The human finger can pick that up very, very quickly. You might think that having a 14-ounce second stage would be impossible to control, that your finger would go right through it. It's not. The human finger can pick up that difference very easily. It's like driving along a perfectly smooth asphalt road and you hit a small bump. You can pick that out. In a stock trigger, the road's full of bumps. As you're bouncing along from one to the other, you don't really notice one bump over the other. It's just a rough road. With our trigger, the first stage is perfectly smooth. The second stage is very discernible. This DMR trigger can be adjusted on the second stage from about 8 ounces on the lowest to probably about a pound, 1.1 or so on the maximum. You might be able to get to 1.3. But either way, you're not going to get a 2-pound or 3-pound second stage out of this. A 1-pound second stage is essentially a 1-pound trigger. 8 ounces, very, very good for bench rest shooting, varmint shooting. The match rifle version can go even lower. We can get 6 ounces out of a match rifle version. You can even go down to 4. Service rifle, you're generally running 0.8 to 1.3 pounds out of it. There is an over travel adjustment on this trigger. It's in the nose, and that is your medium Allen key. We recommend that you leave that over travel adjustment where it is. Everybody has a different preference for how they want over travel. Some shooters do not want the trigger to move right after they break the shot. Others, like myself, feel that the trigger should be swinging back smoothly and not coming to a stop against anything while the projectile's in the barrel. Everybody's different. If you want to adjust this, all you do is take your medium Allen key, fit it in here, turn it clockwise, bring it down, and you're going to have to bring your hammer down, and you're going to have to adjust this until your trigger is just about 0.010 of an inch away from the front SEAR. You're going to have to look down and kind of eyeball that. It's not the most straightforward thing, but it works. Now we're going to install the safety. You have to cock your trigger. If you don't cock the hammer in this, you will not get the trigger in because the back end of the trigger is going to be up. You cock it, put your safety in, install your detent. Now install your pistol grip. And I won't fully install this because I want to show you something. Everybody makes AR parts these days. They're no longer made by just a bill spec vendor. There are some safeties that have a very small gap or slot in them. Our high-speed trigger is a little bit bigger on the back side. And it's bigger because you have to have clearance for all your adjustment screws. Dependent upon your rifle, dependent upon your safety, there may be interference with that safety with the sides of the trigger. Notorious for this is the DPMS LR308 rifle. For whatever reason, the safety's pushed over to one side, and it's just where the detent hole was drilled, because that controls the axial position of your safety in the receiver. Some safeties have a very small slot. If it rubs at all, and you can immediately see this, you can push the safety to one side and pull your trigger, push the safety to the other side and pull your trigger. If it rubs, it's very simple to fix it. And I'd say about maybe 1 in 10 might have a clearance issue here. Most likely you will not. You take a Dremel tool, and this has a cutoff wheel on it. They're available at Home Depot. Right here, you have a mandrel, number 402, and you have a cutoff wheel, 426. You can pick them right up at Home Depot for your Dremel tool. You have a slot. Turn on your Dremel tool, and all you do is just bring this down. And you will clearance the slot in your safety. The instructions show this. They show exactly where you need to remove material. They describe it completely. It only takes a minute or so. And you're not clearancing the parts of the safety that matter when you turn the safety on. It's not going to change how much overlap you have with your safety. So we're going to reinstall our safety here. Put our D10 in. And there we go. You notice I didn't install the first stage, I didn't adjust the first stage. That involves bending a spring. Very simple to do with a pair of pliers. You just take your spring legs, you bend them down slightly to increase the first stage weight, you bend them up to decrease it. The way we have the trigger springs calibrated and made for each of these triggers, they come in probably right where you want them to be. Match rifle, you'll be about a 2-pound first stage. DMR, you'll be about a 3-pound first stage. For service rifle, you're right on 4 pounds. And right here, control your hammer so it doesn't hit the receiver. You have a beautifully linear first stage, icicle, crisp break. This is about a 4-pound or so trigger. We'll look here at some trigger scans. We have a mechanism here that pulls the trigger in a fixture, and as it measures the pull of the trigger, it also measures the force required to actuate it. This scan right here is a M4A1 trigger, essentially identical to an AR-15 trigger, except that the civilian AR-15 triggers are noticeably worse than this one. You'll notice the weight comes up, and then you have this long, jagged plateau, and then the weight drops down right away. In order to drop this hammer, you've got to pull this trigger up to 7 to 8 pounds and rip it off that SEAR while you're ripping across all those jaggedy points. The whole point of a trigger is to set the cartridge off without the weapon moving. That's the whole point of it. Right here, it's readily apparent you cannot do that. You're putting 7 pounds into about a 7-pound weapon. You're going to move the weapon when you pull this trigger. It will shift. You may not notice it in close range shooting or anything like that, but as soon as you try to do any type of accuracy work, you are not going to get that accuracy out of your weapon that it's capable of. You'll also notice down here, this apparatus also measures the lock time. This triggers a 9.4 millisecond lock time. Over here is a trace of our DMR. You'll notice we come right up to about 3 pounds, and then we have this very linear plateau right here, very linear. And right here, you'll see a small vertical line that comes up and a little bump. That's your second stage. When you pull this trigger, you pull it up to 3 pounds, you pull through some very smooth slack. This is reversible. As you pull through to the second stage, if you decide you don't want to take your shot, you can release it, it goes right back down. Can't do that with a stock trigger. You're always pulling through those jaggedy points. You come right up to your second stage. At the instant you want to take the shot, you look at the differential here, it's probably under a pound. That's all it takes. Pound more pull in order to discharge the weapon. This apparatus that we have also checks the lock time, just like the other one here on the Geissele trigger. Geissele trigger has a lock time 4.4 milliseconds versus almost 10 for a standard AR-15 trigger. In comparison, a Remington 700 is about 2.5 milliseconds. So it's very close to a bolt gun lock time. This is very important when you're trying to do accuracy work or you're shooting for groups. There's also another design feature of this hammer which I do not mention in written literature because I don't have a way to really check it, but it's something that I designed into the hammer back in 2004. This hammer is extremely light. It has our exclusive I-beam profile to it. It has a very small strike face here that just reaches up, and the hand is what smacks the firing pin. In this hammer, I designed the center of percussion to be very close in line with the center line of the firing pin. And what this does is it decreases the amount of reaction force into the receiver of the weapon through the pivot pin. If you've ever swung a baseball bat and hit a baseball and you hit it on the sweet spot of the baseball bat, you'll feel almost no force or anything in your hand. You'll know right away that when you hit that baseball, you got a good hit and that thing's going to take off. Same with a golf club. If you hit it off the sweet spot on your baseball bat, it stings your hand. If you hit it off the sweet spot on your golf club, you can feel a dead sound and you know that golf ball is not going to go where you want it or as far as you wanted it. Same thing with a hammer. The stock hammer, when it smacks that firing pin, puts a lot of that energy, the kinetic energy imparted to the hammer from the hammer spring, puts it into the weapon and disturbs your aim. If you've ever taken a scoped rifle, or if you're slung up prone with a service rifle or NRA match rifle, you drop the hammer of a stock hammer, you'll see your sights move. With this one here and the center of percussion near the firing pin, there is very little movement, if anything, of those sights. When it drops, you will think that this hammer is too weak to set off the firing pin because there's no thunk. It's just a smooth type of that's all it is. First thing that a lot of people say when they see this is, man, that light hammer, that's not going to be able to set off a primer consistently. In fact, it's putting more energy into that firing pin than a stock hammer. It's not putting energy back into the weapon through the receiver, so your sights aren't moving. The hammer will set off any ammunition, any hard primered military primers, any 308. It'll even set off steel cased, hard primered Russian cartridges. Lock time is very important in any type of a firearm. With our 4.4 millisecond that comes out of this DMR trigger, it really helps with snap shooting, or in the case of high power shooting, it helps it with your offhand. The first shot I ever fired with this trigger right here was an offhand shot, and this was back in May 2004. You know, I'd put about a month's worth of design work into this hammer, and I knew it was going to be fast. I didn't know how fast it was going to be, and I didn't know how crisp it was going to be either. And I'm an NRA service rifle shooter, and I picked the weapon up, and I was down at Cumberland Rifleman, down in Cumberland County, New Jersey, all by myself on the range, and I was shooting at a standard SR1 target at 200 yards. And I stood there, and if you haven't shot high power before, and you're standing trying to shoot at 200 yards at a 13-inch black dot, you'll notice that your sights move around quite a bit. I don't have an excellent offhand hold, as I'm sure many high power shooters who are listening to this can probably relate to it. As your front post moves around the target, sometimes it's totally off the black. You have to be able to discharge your weapon when your front sight post is in the black and you have a sight picture. When it's moving, you're not able to do that. In my case, as the sight is moving, I have to be able to pull back on that trigger very quickly in order to have that shot fall where it's intended. And in this case, I shoot what's called center of mass hold. I do not have the black dot on top of the sight. I basically bisect the black with the front sight post. And when I let this shot go, that front sight post was about halfway off the black over to the right hand side. And I called the shot a wide 9. If you've ever, you know, your older guys will relate to this. If you've ever watched a movie, older movies, real movies, you'll be watching them and you'll be seeing something on the movie screen and the reel will break and you'll see a blank screen in front of you. Well, for a couple seconds after that film has broken, you'll be able to visualize that last moment of the film, and you can describe what was happening in there even though it's not on the screen in front of you. And it's the same thing with being on call when you're shooting offhand. As you lose the rifle and as you lose the front sight in recoil, you know where that front sight post was when the shot broke, and it's called call. And if you are always on call, if you know that you shot a wide 9 at 3 o'clock or you shot an 8 down low, God forbid, you're shooting well. You know where your shots are going. If you think you shot out to the right and you shot out to the left, well, there's a problem. There's a problem with your weapon, or you're jerking it or something like that. And in this particular case, I called a wide 9. And when I went and looked through my spotting scope, it was actually at 10 at 3 o'clock. With this 4.4 millisecond lock time in this trigger, you are within your call in high power. So many shooters have told me how much of a difference this trigger makes in their scores. It's unbelievable. I had one fella, he would shoot consistently in the lower 180s. Your score, of course, that you're trying to perfect score in offhand is 200. By putting in this trigger, he went up into the lower 190s. He said he gained a consistent 12 points with this trigger. I've heard other comments where people call a rifle equipped with a high-speed trigger a laser beam. I've heard some shooters say that this trigger reads your mind. The break is so sharp that there is no need, in order to put additional pressure like a single stage trigger and try to have the trigger break when you're not expecting it. You may have been taught that when you were, when you first learned to shoot when you were a kid, that you want to try to pull the trigger and not expect when it breaks. Not with this trigger. This trigger directly connects your finger and your brain with the inanimate. The animate and the inanimate are connected very nicely with this trigger. It's just a thought, and you can break the shot. Now, I know what you're thinking, that this cat is whacked trying to sell you this trigger and making all these claims. Bill Geissele is not a salesman. I cannot sell things. The only thing I can do is design things that sell themselves. And in this case, when you get this trigger and you get it in your weapon, I think you'll agree with me that this is the best trigger on the market out there, and that you'd be very happy with it. In another couple video segments, we're going to go over the match rifle trigger and specific adjustments for that. And in another one, we're going to go over the service rifle trigger, which is going to be specific to NRA service rifle competition. This drawing in my hands illustrates the exclusive I-beam hammer of the Geissele high-speed trigger. If you notice how it interfaces with the firing pin, it's got a very small hand or flat strike face that reaches up and hits the firing pin. It doesn't have a lot of metal at the very top of the hammer, and this is one of the design features that allows it to get its 4.4 millisecond lock time. Let's talk a little bit about all the different parts of the Geissele high-speed trigger. This here is a section view of the trigger assembly. We have the trigger, we have the hammer. This is what's known as the disconnector. This here is the safety. This screw that's underneath the tower is the SEAR adjustment screw. This set screw in the disconnector adjusts the second stage weight through this spring follower right here. This is the disconnector spring that's kind of chopped up here from the section view. In front is the set screw that adjusts the over travel for the trigger. This drawing illustrates how a two-stage trigger operates. Here's our trigger, here's our hammer, this is our disconnector. This structure you see right here is the trigger SEAR, and right here you see the hammer and hammer SEAR. And if you notice the overlap of the two SEARs or the two ledges, there's a fair amount of overlap there. That overlaps probably in the range of about a 32nd of an inch. And if you notice here that there's a gap in between the disconnector and the hammer tail. When the trigger's pulled, and in this drawing right here, the trigger has been pulled about 5 degrees, you'll notice that the tail of the hammer is now hitting the disconnector, and this is what gives you the stop point or the wall on your second stage when you come up to it. You'll notice right here the hammer is barely hanging on the trigger SEAR. That overlap right there is about 3 to 5 thousandths of an inch. You'll also notice down here on our secondary SEAR, which I declined to mention in the other drawing, you'll notice how they're pulled apart. That secondary SEAR, when the trigger's forward and has been pulled, that is an additional blocking mechanism of the trigger. So there's basically has a redundant safety mechanism. The hammer cannot go forward unless the trigger's pulled. We're going to discuss now the adjustment of the match rifle trigger. Match rifle trigger, very similar to DMR. Basically, the only differences are in the springs. It has a different trigger spring and it has a different disconnector spring. The hammer spring brings the first stage in at about 2 pounds or so. The disconnector spring allows you to get under 8 ounces on the second stage break. So with the spring combination from the factory, this trigger's probably set up at about, in the range about 2.5 pounds. If you wanted to change it for the first stage, right here is a trigger spring, and let's say you wanted to make it a little bit heavier. All you'd have to do is take a pair of pliers. In this case, this is a pair of duckbill pliers. You don't want to use needle nose pliers, just any type of a flat plier. You hold the spring right near where it exits out of the coil, and you bend down just a little bit, and you can do one leg at a time. You don't have to do 2 legs. And that right there will probably bring up your first stage weight, maybe about 0.3 of a pound or so. You can also go in the other direction and lower the first stage weight. Your limitation in lowering your first stage weight is you will get to a point where the trigger will not return. After you pull it, it will not go forward. This is all dependent upon each individual trigger, each individual weapon. Generally, that lower limit is about 1.5 pounds. You really don't want to go below that, and I really don't recommend going much below 2 pounds at all, just because as you lose lubrication, you may find yourself at a point where the trigger may not return properly and you'll have to push it forward with your finger. You really don't want to do that. So 2 pounds on the first stage is very light, and of course you can get your second stage down to 6 ounces, which is just about a perfect trigger for bench rest or varmint shooting. We're going to discuss adjustment of the service rifle trigger here. Service rifle trigger is always meant to be above 4.5 pounds. That's the lower weight limit in CMP and NRA service rifle competition. Service rifle trigger differs from the DMR in that it has a much heavier trigger spring, but it does have the same disconnector spring. So on your second stage break, your lower limit's about 8 ounces, your upper limit 1.2, 1.3 pounds. The trigger spring is about a 4-pound pull right out of the bag. So what this means is when you set it up, you're going to be above 4.5 pounds even without adjusting anything. You can set this up with a trigger pull gauge. There's several aftermarket ones out there. We use one from Hunter Spring in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. The trouble with setting it up with a gauge rather than the actual weights that are used during a leg match is that the gauge might not correspond to the weights. There's an uncertainty of about plus or minus a half a pound with any gauge. It depends upon where the gauge hits on the trigger bow. It depends upon how far the gauge is out to clear your pistol grip or your stock. You can't really get a true and accurate reading with a gauge. You can get close, but it's not perfect. You always have to check your weight with a set of weights. I recommend that the service rifle trigger is set up no lighter than 5 pounds on a new trigger. Over the course of about 500 to 1,000 rounds, the trigger will lose about a half a pound in weight. If you set it up dead nuts on 4.5 pounds, it will go below that and you will not make weight at a leg match. It may feel perfect to you in your shop when you're first putting this in, but at your second or third leg match, it's going to be 7 o'clock in the morning and they're going to start shooting at 7:30 in the morning, and the next thing you know, your trigger doesn't pass weight and you're scrambling in order to bring the weight up. Set it up heavy, set it up at 5 pounds, let it decrease over time, and you can go back in and check it. Always check it with a set of NRA approved weights. This is how it's done. If you don't have a set, maybe one of your buddies has a set, make sure that this little centering device that hits the trigger bow is always in the same spot that it's supposed to be. Make sure that you're always in the center of the bow. When you pick it up, as you notice, it hangs freely, and just a little jerk down sets it off. That's a perfect service rifle trigger right there. You'll always make weight with that trigger. Let me just show you how to lubricate this. Here's our Geissele oil, as we call it. 1 drop on top of the disconnector. 1 drop on each side of the trigger spring. On each side, let it run down the receiver. Here's our grease for the SEAR. You can use oil on the SEAR if you want. We recommend this type of grease. It'll last a long time. Just put a dab here on the inside, dab on the outside of the tail, a little bit on the face of the disconnector here, and a little bit under the trigger. That's all you need. Every once in a while, just add more grease. You don't have to clean it off. Just a little bit more. That'll last thousands of rounds. Thanks for listening today. I appreciate your time. Take care.